There's something special about painted miniatures, at least for me, when it comes to playing tabletop gaming. But I get it. It's not something that everybody feels like they can do, whether it be due to time constraints or skill restraints or even sometimes disabilities. I want to make this very clear up front. Today's video isn't about shaming people who play with gray miniatures. It's about inspiring people with gray miniatures who want to paint their minis, who want to be able to have a fully painted army, but either feel like they don't have the time, don't have the skill level, etc., etc., etc. In today's video, I'm going to be painting Warhammer Age of Sigmar Stormcast Eternals. I'm going to be painting 3 of them, and I'm going to be doing them in a very basic standard. Locally, we have a lot of tournaments which require 3 colors, so I'm going to be referring to that as a tournament standard 3-color minimum. Then we're going to do what I refer to as Tabletop or Tabletop Plus, which is where we bring in all of the shadows and the highlights. And then the third one is going to be me adding a lot of extra detail, which is typically the length that I take my commander units to, regardless of what game I'm playing. So that will basically just, in my theory, be a tiered system for you guys to be able to see. Now, we're doing this in a way where you can paint all your miniatures at that base level. And then if you want to, take some of them to the next level, and then either take them all to the 3rd level or just do your commanders at that 3rd level. And I want to show you how easy it is and how time consuming it is or isn't. So I will also be timing myself as to how long each level takes me, so that you guys have a better understanding of how easy or how difficult some of these paint jobs can be. But I'm also going to be throwing a bit of a twist on it. I'm actually going to try to limit my palette. And the reason I want to limit my palette is, well, basically, if you guys are just getting started, you might have started out with a paint the Warhammer Eternals paint set, like the starter set that Games Workshop sells. And I reviewed one a while back to prove that you can paint box art standard using just the paints that come in that box. And I'll link that somewhere here as well as down in the description if you guys are interested in checking that out. But I want to try to limit my palette by adding as few colors as possible, because I want to show you guys that just buying 1 or 2 extra bottles of paint can be all you need to really get yourself through the army. There's a lot of people out there that also think that buying paint is too expensive, that you're gonna have to buy like 20 or 30 bottles to be able to paint an army to completion, but that's just not the case. So I'm gonna try to limit myself to just the colors that come with the paint set, and then maybe add 1 or 2 at the end for my big commander unit, just to prove that you don't need to buy a ton of paint to be able to make your models look good. So here's our starting point. We're going to be starting out with basic plastic, the gray plastic. I'm not even going to be putting primer on it. Now, I will be using an airbrush, and the only reason I'm going to be using an airbrush is it gets me a smooth finish. However, also, the color that I am using, the gold, is available as a spray paint. So you guys could, if you wanted to buy the spray paint, use that to supplement the airbrush. Now, as for airbrushing the blue on the shields, well, if you want to just use Macragge blue to knock out those shields and then darken them a little bit by painting them by hand, you absolutely could. It's not the end of the world. Or you could just paint them by hand. I already had the airbrush out, so I figured why not. It's not necessarily the elephant in the room, but you're going to notice that I left the shields off. And I left the shields off because it makes it a lot easier to paint. If a shield is covering something up, it's kind of hard to get your paintbrush in there to paint it. And while although some people will just leave that alone, and there's nothing wrong with that, I personally like to try and paint as much of the model as I can see. And making that easier for myself, I just left the shields off. Now this is something you have to think about when you're putting the model together. It's kind of hard to pop them apart later. Another thing that I like to do that you may want to keep in consideration is if the head is easily removed, so to speak, like it was its own piece to put on, you may want to put that on a piece of wire, and it'll make it a lot easier to paint in and around the neck and then paint the head individually. Now, because of how these models go together, they're kind of attached to the arms internally with the substructure, and the only way to get those heads off for me would have been to have cut them off, which would have been a lot more work to reattach them later. So I just went ahead and left them on. So here's our starting point. Plain plastic. The details are there, but you know, when they're on the table 5 feet away, it's kind of hard to see the details. When I look at an unpainted miniature, I kind of see it as a placeholder for what it could be. It could just be another soldier, it could be a commander, it could be the hero of the realm if you're playing D&D, but I feel like your character only tells a surface level story until you start putting paint to the model. And that's where it really starts to shine, at least for me. It kind of helps immerse me into the world while I'm playing the game. And I know that that doesn't matter to everybody. So if you're cool with playing with gray miniatures, then that's fine. Alright, let's start with something quick. The base coat. Now in the case of the miniature, we based it in gold. The case of the shield, we based it in blue. Now there are some gold details that we're going to have to knock out by hand on the shield, as well as there's some blue details we're going to have to knock out on the miniature. But we already had those colors out because we were using the airbrush, so that's no big deal. I want to start with these colors, even though they may not be the easiest to work with when it comes to the grand scheme, because if we're going to be doing batch painting, which you might be doing when you're painting a whole army, trying to knock out the same color all at once is going to help you save paint, which ultimately helps you save money. One downside to this is going to be the fact that the inside of the cloak is painted white. That is part of the Stormcast Eternal color scheme. It didn't used to be, but it is now. And painting white can be kind of difficult if you're not using an airbrush or a spray paint can. So this is probably going to require quite a few layers in order for it to look good. Now, one trick that I find for getting a nice, really smooth white is kind of blending it in with an off-white. For some reason, taking Corax and just putting the tiniest little bit of an off-white into it seems to really help. Now, if you're just using the base paint set that you got, the Learn to Paint set, this might be a little bit difficult for you, but Corax tends to be a little chunky. So if you thoroughly blend it together on your palette, whether it be a hard palette or a wet palette, you should get a pretty smooth finish. Just know that you're going to be applying a lot of thin layers, and especially with white, if you try to do a lot quickly by doing thick layers, it's gonna look chalky. There's no way around that. So this is one of those things where you have to decide how much work am I willing to put in for the payout. Now real quick, a tip for painting white, if you're not limited on the colors that are available to you, is layers. If you're going from a dark layer to a brighter layer, just putting white on top of a dark blue or a black or something is going to end up with this muddy gray color, and it's going to take forever to build up that white. So if you can transition over several layers from like a dark blue into a gray, into a brighter gray, into an off-white, into your pure white, you're going to be able to build up to white significantly faster than if you just put white on top of your original base coat. Now again, this is going to take time and it is going to take effort, but the final result, in my opinion, is at least worthwhile. And again, if you're lurking with a limited palette, then mixing in a slight off-white into your original white and just building it up with thin successive layers is going to be your best option. So we've got our gold, we've got our blue, and we've got our white. Technically, that's our tournament standard, not including however I'm going to end up painting the base. Honestly, if you're somebody who doesn't really care about the base, you might want to just base it in black or gray or something like that, unless it's a decorative base, in which case I encourage you to try and do something fancy with it, but you don't have to. Now, it's not going to win any awards, and that's alright. It's still yours. You took the time and the effort. You've got your 3 colors on there, ignoring the base, of course, but it's yours, and it didn't take that long. Moving along with our second miniature, I'm going to go ahead and break out the black. Now, a lot of the Learn to Paint sets that GW sells tends to come with black or some kind of darker color, so I'm not really going to count this as a new color, but yeah, it technically is. Now you're going to see that I am just placing this into those recesses in between the joints in the armor. I do the same thing on my Space Marines, and although I doubt that the Stormcast have a black rubber, there's probably some kind of black fabric under their armor preventing chafing and things like that. Now, something else that I am adding, which is going to be a new color, is our leather. Now, I'm starting out with a base of Mournfang Brown for all of our leathers, but you could start out with something like XV88, which is, in my opinion, one of my favorite leather colors. And then I tend to turn my Mournfang Brown into a glaze and glaze that into the shadows and recesses. I think you get a much more realistic result that way. However, I was trying to keep things simple from the mindset of either not necessarily speed painting, but batch painting a whole army. And it just made more sense to start with Mournfang Brown and then lightly layer in some XV88 as a highlight. Although, I suppose if we're going to do it that way, that does mean that I have now added 3 colors in total to our new paint job. However, we're not really going to be taking it a lot farther than that. I'm going to be taking the Mournfang Brown and putting it on the back of the shield, which unfortunately I forgot to record, but you can see that it kind of adds a bit of a faux wood finish to the backside of the shield, and I think it really adds a lot of depth to at least the Stormcast models, and we'll be taking that a step farther in our 3rd model, but we'll be talking about that more later. One of the things that we're going to be moving on with, though, is we're also going to be adding a wash to all of the gold armor. And this is to both simulate kind of the reflectiveness of the sun by adding a little bit of orange in, but we're also going to be using this to kind of recess shade and then go back in with our gold and re-highlight up in any places that may have gotten muddy. Typically with a wash, we're just going to apply it to the entire model, but I have found that if we're trying to save some time, it not only dries faster, but also, in my personal opinion, it allows you to have a little bit more control if you just apply it directly to the recesses. But if you don't feel comfortable with that and you're not 100% sure where you want it all to settle, then go ahead and wash the whole model and then re-highlight back up to gold from there. Last but not least, I'm going to be painting the crystal on this one. Now, I'm just going to paint it a simple green, and I'll do some highlights on the 3rd one, but again, as I've said before, we'll talk more about that when we get to that one. Now we're going to be building up our highlights here. Now, traditionally, if you're following more of an heavy metal, they're going to have you kind of coat everything in a darker wash and then use your original base tone to kind of put your mid-tones back on the model and then build up your highlights from there. Not too dissimilar to how we handled the gold. However, in my case, especially with fabrics, a lot of times I like to base in what is going to be my darkest color and then highlight up from there. This is something that I've developed over time, and I think gives you a lot more control over your colors and gives you a more consistent final result. This is a technique that is unfortunately something that you have to teach yourself. It's not something that's going to come natural. GW's way of just washing everything and then re-highlighting the highlights and then edge highlighting from there is really conducive for new players and new painters. So if you're new, You may want to do it GW's way, and that's absolutely fine. You can find out how to do heavy metal from a box art standard by going back and watching my previous Stormcast Eternals box set review, where I do a breakdown of how I make heavy metal a little bit easier for new painters. In any case, I'm building up by blending in a brighter blue into my original base tone, and then I'm kind of just going over everywhere that would have an edge highlight, and I'm covering less and less of the surface as I add more and more blue, or brighter blue I should say. And this is going to give me a smoother finish in my personal opinion when it comes to the final result, and kind of helps to blend the colors together a little bit better without having to lean too heavily on adding washes, which not always, but sometimes can darken your recesses a little bit more than we might like. And here we have our reveal for our Tabletop Plus. Now, yeah, things are a little scratchy, but again, I'm kind of taking this from the perspective of trying to batch paint and kind of knock this out relatively quickly while still getting a decent result. And as you can see with the scratchy texture on the fabrics, I think it works quite well and gives a very stylized approach. Now, this miniature did take about 45 minutes in total, which includes the original 30 minutes from the previous miniature, building up from there. So only about 15 to 20 minutes worth of additional work, depending upon how far you really want to take this. Now, for the last one, and arguably one that is going to probably take the most time, and that is just going until I am satisfied. This is the level that I would take most of my commander units to. So let's crack on with that one. Alright, third verse, same as the second. Yeah, I think that'll still work here. So basically, I've had to take a couple weeks off for some personal projects, which leads me to want to give one more piece of advice when tackling our hobbies. If you can get to a good stopping point, you should. I feel like that's something I shouldn't need to say, but oftentimes I have people come into live streams and ask me, hey, how do I teach myself how to reblend a color I made a couple of weeks ago? And oftentimes I'll say, you can't unless you wrote down the formula of how you did it the first time, but you can get really close, and oftentimes that's good enough. But if you can get all the way through using that custom color and work your way through to a good stopping point where you're not going to need that custom color anymore, then that's a really great thing to do. In the case of today's model, I had knocked out the base coats of the armor. I had knocked out the highlights on all of the fabric, except for a highlight that I was using that was a color directly out of a bottle, so I'm not having to mix anything. And I had finished the base coats on the leather as well as the wood effect for the backside of the shield. So I was in a really great place to stop. So basically, I'm at a great starting point. So let's start as if we're picking up from step 2. We've got our basic level of highlights done, and although I have not highlighted and shaded the armor quite yet, that is because I want to take just a little extra time to do that, as opposed to just haphazardly slapping those on like we did for the second model. And this is something that you can kind of clean up and get to where I'm going to be if you were doing this step by step, as opposed to doing it from bare plastic to the end of step 3. So it's not really too detrimental if you think about it. In any case, basically I'm just going to be a little bit more selective on where my highlights and my shadows end up. Number 1, our first big change we're going to be making from the first 2 models is we're going to be adding a little bit of gray into the shadow on the inside of the cloak where the white is. And then we're also going to kind of go ahead and take a deeper blue and we're going to shade that into the recesses on the outside of the fabric. Now, as you can see here, I'm being a lot more selective when it comes to my edge highlights and where I'm placing them. We're not being quite as haphazard, I'm not doing any kind of heroical highlighting where I'm wrapping that highlight around the edge like I've done in the previous miniatures, and I'm just kind of keeping them to where I want my most extreme highlights are going to be. And then I'm going to do a mixture of contrast as well as blending in my darker tones to kind of get the fabric to where I want it to be. One of the first altercations I really wanted to make, especially on the fabric, was to go ahead and add some gray to the inside of that cloak. Now, because this is a relatively small detail, it's something that tends to get missed unless someone's really going to pick up the model and look at it, especially when it comes to white. White is one of those colors that, at least in my opinion, regardless of the scale, tends to cast a lot of its own shadows, or at least your brain tends to think that it does. And you can get away with just painting a flat white, especially on small details. But again, with something that someone's going to pick up and manipulate and look in the light, for this higher level of detail, I really wanted to go ahead and blend up some grays and go ahead and apply those to my shadows. I'm also going to be pushing that contrast by adding purple into my shade that I'm blending into the shadows. Now, typically a lot of people might think to go ahead and use black, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But I've started to really enjoy only using black in my deepest recesses, and I try to more often than not blend other darker colors into my shadows. I think this gives the model a more realistic feel when you're looking at it, and if you're going to have a blend of models on the table with different levels of detail, I also hope that this helps things to kind of blend together, whereas if you were to have a ton of shadows that used pure black to kind of deepen and darken everything, I think they stand out a little bit too much compared to models that don't have that. Now, I used a real mixture of washes on the gold and then re-highlighted up, and this is because, in my opinion, when you darken Retributor, it ends up being its own best highlight. Now, outside of the Retributor armor, the colors that I'm really using here are not super important. One thing to keep in mind is that I'm wanting more of my brownish golden colors, like the top of a freshly baked loaf of bread. Those kinds of colors are what I'm trying to keep on the surface and the deepest recesses of my gold. Whereas the more brown the color is, like the color of dirt, I'm trying to blend that in to the bottom shades and crevices of the armor. And this is a little bit tricky because gold being reflective, it's not just going to reflect light the way that we think it is. You know, we think grass on the ground, then maybe there'll be some green reflections in the bottom of the armor, and the sky being blue, it'll be much brighter. And well, there's not necessarily something wrong with that. You also have to think about the fact that the exposed leg on the right hand side of the model could be reflecting some of that blue skylight back up into the bottom chest piece and the bottom of the right arm. And if you're going for a competition piece, these are things that you need to keep in mind. Whereas with this commander, we have a little bit of creative freedoms where we're not super confined by things like that, but keeping them in mind can also help to make things feel a little bit more correct. So if you're looking at your model and something isn't feeling quite right, think about how the light reflects off all the shiny things, and maybe you've made some of your shadows a little too dark in places, or you've made some of your highlights a little too bright in places because of the way that the armor might be reflecting light. That's a really great thing to keep in mind when you're not 100% sure what's wrong with the model. Now, some of you more experienced miniature painters out there are probably thinking, well, you're not going dark enough in some of your recesses, and I would argue that you are correct. However, I am red-green colorblind, and a lot of the warmer tones tend to kind of mess with my eyes a little bit, and I find myself darkening things probably farther than they should, and I think that's pretty evident by my attempt at non-metallic metal. Something that I would like to revisit soon, probably on a much smaller scale, maybe on a couple of weapons or a shield or something, as opposed to just focusing on an entire miniature as a whole. and perhaps revisiting it again with bits and pieces of armor, again, rather than with an entire miniature, and then coming back and combining everything I've learned. Now, if you're interested in seeing my first attempt at non-metallic metal, I'll go ahead and put a link to that either here or in the video's description. Now, I didn't want to do anything too crazy with the leather on this figure as well as with the crystal, as they're pretty small details. So with the leather, I actually just used Kislev Flesh as my highlight color, and I just mixed a tiny bit of XV88 into that in order to kind of make it more of a dull tan color. When it comes to the crystal, I used Colia Green Shade to just kind of add a little bit of shadow to the inside edge of the crystal, and then I left everything else exactly as it is. No edge highlights or anything like that, but if I were to take this one step up, I would edge highlight that crystal with probably like an ice yellow or a lemon yellow, something really extreme to just make the edge highlights on that crystal pop. Moving on to the shield, I wanted to go ahead and do some kind of wood grain effect on the inside of the shield. Now, I'm not going for anything crazy realistic. I just want something that's going to sell the facade. So I'm taking a bunch of different wood colors, a lot of wood tones. Think anything that might even remotely have brown in it. And you're going to pick about 3 or 4 of those. And I'm being vague about this because I don't really have an exact formula. Every time I do this, I pick similar colors or different colors, and it always kind of turns out the same. So I don't have an exact formula for this yet, but I am working on something for a future video when it comes to wood grain. In any case, we're just going to do these nice little squiggly striations going from top to bottom, or whatever direction you want your wood grain to go. Now, do keep in mind that the more and the thinner you add, the more realistic, and the thicker and the less, the more cartoonish you're going to get. So do keep that in mind, or at least that's how it feels in my opinion. Another thing is, if you want to get some really nice dark lines for shadows, or breaking this up into planks and actually drawing planks on the back of the shield, I really recommend using some kind of a marker, something that's got a brush tip to it. You're going to get a much better result if you've got shaky hands. Or if you want to do it all by hand, I recommend adding just a little bit of brown into your black paint, and that'll do a really great job at doing shadows. Now, I want to take a second to kind of break down some of the decisions that got made here. Now, you're going to notice that the little crystal on his belt has not been painted. I've left that generically gold because I thought painting the crystal blue would blend in with the cape. And again, for this miniature, I was trying to stick with my limited color palette based on the Start Collecting Stormcast box, which is also why the belt on this miniature is also not painted. And I have limited myself with just a basic Corax white for the inside of the cloak. There's a lot of little details on this miniature, a lot of like little leather straps and things like that that I typically do paint in a brown. But again, with this limited color palette, I really had to decide what was worth painting and what wasn't. And for only using 3 colors, I feel like this strikes a pose in a sense. And yes, it is posed, but I mean, the color scheme itself strikes a pose. I feel like this is the minimum amount of color that we could have put on this while still maintaining what a Stormcast looks like, especially at a distance. So I'm pretty happy with how this one turned out. He actually only took me about 30 minutes from start to finish, which seems like a lot for what he is. But when you take into account some of the finer details, both on the shield and on some of the accoutrements and the little rivets and things, you can see why I might want to slow down. Also, the white took a few more coats than I was expecting, which also kind of drug out this paint scheme. But all in all, he's pretty great, and I would have based him separately if I were painting this just for myself, as it would have made painting the base a lot easier, but it's not the end of the world, and we will base all 3 of these models the same way at the end of the video. And here we have our reveal for our Tabletop Plus. Now, yeah, things are a little scratchy, but again, I'm kind of taking this from the perspective of trying to batch paint and gonna knock this out relatively quickly while still getting a decent result. And as you can see with the scratchy texture on the fabrics, I think it works quite well and gives a very stylized approach. Now this miniature did take about 45 minutes in total, which includes the original 30 minutes from the previous miniature, building up from there. So only about 15 to 20 minutes worth of additional work, depending upon how far you really want to take this. And here we have the last one. Now this one was a lot of fun and took a lot more time to paint than I actually thought it was going to. All in all, including the time it took me to set up shots, transfer things out of my camera, blah blah blah, it took me about 3 hours, which is a lot of work. But honestly, I think if I were doing 5 or 6 of these guys all at once, not recording them for a video, and I already understood what the paint scheme was going to be, it would probably be pretty easy for me to knock out 4 or 5 of these guys in about an hour and a half to 2 hours for all 5 of them. And I think that's pretty reasonable, especially considering the standard that we managed to get everything to. Now I am going to be comparing these to some other Stormcasts that I've painted as well, just so you guys can get a rough idea of different ways that you can paint these. But I think you'll agree that all 3 of these look great, regardless of what level of detail you take them to, and in my personal opinion look a lot better than unpainted or at the very least primed. That said, I understand that this is not something that everybody can do, and like I said at the beginning of the video, this is to inspire people who want to paint their miniatures. I understand that there are people out there who have no desire to paint their miniatures, and if you're one of those people but you still watch this video all the way to the end, thank you very much. In any case, I am going to leave you guys with a little bit of a slideshow of some of my other work that is revolving around the Stormcast Eternals. But I hope that you guys took something away from today's video regardless. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, may your display case always be filled and your pile of shame never run empty. Until next time.